Mark had worked at the same grocery store chain for years. Since he was 18, in fact. It was the only job he had ever known, and he spent nearly 3 years working his way through various positions. By the time he was 21, he had worked every shift imaginable and had become the go-to person in the deli, handling multiple stations with ease. The store was a well-known chain in the South, one of those places that everyone had heard of. Mark didn't mind the work. Sure, there were the usual frustrations, long hours, difficult customers, and management that didn't always seem to care about their employees. But it was a job. It paid the bills, and he was used to it. But that all changed one fateful day when Mark, at 19 years old, was working his usual shift in the deli section. It started off like any other day. Mark had been making Asian food in the deli's food station, surrounded by the usual hustle and bustle of the kitchen. He was kneeling down to grab some sauces from a low fridge when he took a deep breath. That's when it hit him. Something slammed into the back of his head, a feeling that was sharp and immediate. Mark was thrown off balance for a moment, but quickly brushed it off, assuming it was just some cleaning chemicals or fumes from the work going on around the store. The contractor had been around the area doing some work, and it didn't seem like anything unusual. He thought he was fine, until he wasn't. Mark stood up with the wok of orange chicken in his hands, feeling the weight of it for a second, and then it started. His vision blurred, and a strange haze settled over his mind. His feet began to feel like lead, and his balance gave way. Before he knew it, Mark was stumbling backwards, barely catching himself on the counter behind him. One of the elderly servers, a woman Mark had worked with for years, noticed immediately. "Mark, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. But Mark didn't know how to answer. His body felt like it was betraying him, and he couldn't focus long enough to make sense of what was happening. His vision darkened, his heart raced painfully, and it felt like everything was spinning out of control. He had no idea what was going on. But whatever it was bad. He knew that. I'm fine," he managed to mumble, trying to stand upright and steady himself, but his words came out thick, like he couldn't form the sentences properly. The elderly server wasn't convinced, though. She saw how pale Mark had become, how his color had drained from his face. "You're not okay," she insisted. "Sit down. Let me get you some water." Mark's brother, who worked in the same store, came running over to check on him. Mark could barely remember the moments after that, but he knew his brother had helped him walk to the nearby indoor cafe. His head was swimming, and his legs felt like jelly, unable to hold him up. Every step felt like an effort. Once seated, Mark's body trembled uncontrollably. He felt as if his entire nervous system was in overdrive. His chest was tight, and his heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst. Tears welled up in his eyes, and before he knew it, he was crying, something he couldn't explain to anyone. He couldn't even articulate why he felt the way he did. It was all too much. "I don't know what's happening to me," he said, voice cracking. "I don't know why I feel like this." His brother returned with a cup of water, helping Mark drink it in tiny sips. "I don't know either, but you need to rest. Whatever happened, it's not normal." But Mark couldn't relax. His body was still in panic mode, and nothing he did could calm the shaking, the racing heart, or the dizziness. Mark's mind was a blur, the world spinning around him like he was trapped in a fog. He could hear the murmurs of people talking around him, but everything seemed so far away. His vision was dim, and the pressure in his head was building, making it feel like someone was squeezing his skull. It wasn't just dizziness, it was a complete disorientation. He couldn't focus, couldn't move without feeling like he was going to collapse. His brother was right there with him, trying to help. But Mark couldn't understand what was happening. He just kept thinking about how his body felt, how weak, how off balance. He wanted to throw up, but he couldn't. His chest felt tight, and his breathing was shallow. "You need to sit still, Mark," his brother kept saying, his voice full of concern. "Don't try to move too much." But it wasn't helping. The more time passed, the worse it got. Mark's heart raced as he tried to steady his breathing, but it wasn't working. He felt completely helpless. What had happened? He had no idea. His mind kept going back to the moment he had bent down to grab the sauces from the fridge. He had smelled something in the air. Something sharp, something toxic, maybe? He wasn't sure. He just knew that whatever it was, it had triggered this response in his body. That's when the manager walked into the cafe. Instead of offering help or taking any kind of initiative to figure out what had caused this reaction, the manager simply looked at Mark and gave a dismissive shrug. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone more annoyed than concerned. "You're just overreacting. There's nothing wrong with the air, nothing wrong with the kitchen." Mark was still panicking, still struggling to sit up straight. His head kept spinning, and he felt like he was slipping in and out of consciousness. But the manager? He didn't even ask if Mark needed medical help. He didn't even ask if there was something wrong with the kitchen. Instead, he told Mark to go back to work. "You've been sitting here long enough," the manager said, his voice cold and indifferent. "Get back to your station. Customers are waiting." It was like a punch to the gut. Here he was, barely able to stay upright, and his manager didn't even care. He wasn't concerned about his well-being. He was worried about customers and productivity. That's all it seemed to come down to for them. Mark wasn't even a person in that moment. He was just a cog in the machine. And that machine didn't care if he was on the brink of collapse. But Mark wasn't about to go back to work. Not like this. He wasn't about to put himself back in the kitchen where he could barely stand, let alone operate a stove or deal with customers. "I can't," Mark muttered, his voice shaking. "I can't go back there." But the manager wasn't listening. He simply told Mark to clock out, not to waste time, and to get back to work after a short break. Mark's brother, seeing the complete lack of care, stepped in. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly, standing up. "Mark's not going anywhere. He's not even stable enough to walk." But the manager didn't listen to that either. Instead, he turned his attention to his phone, dismissing them both like they were nothing. It was at that moment Mark realized. They didn't care. They didn't care about his health, and they certainly didn't care about his well-being. Mark's brother helped him stand and led him to the manager's office. He was still struggling to keep his balance, and every step felt like an impossible task. But he made it, and they stood there in the office while the manager continued to ignore their concerns. The situation only worsened. After a while, the manager finally gave Mark permission to leave, but only after Mark had texted his father. That's when Mark knew things were about to take a turn. He pulled out his phone, his hand still shaking, and quickly texted his father the essentials. "Dad, I don't know what's happening. I feel like I'm going to pass out. I need you." It wasn't easy. The words felt heavy, like they didn't belong in a message that was supposed to be about the mundane day-to-day stuff. And then, in a moment that made everything feel like it might be okay, Mark's father responded, "I'm on my way. Clock out and wait for me. I'll be there." Mark's heart skipped a beat when he saw those words. He wasn't alone. His dad was coming. In that moment, everything changed. He wasn't just some kid who could be ignored anymore. He wasn't just an employee in a system that cared more about profits than people. He was going to have someone in his corner. Someone who knew how to fight back. Mark texted the manager that he needed to leave, and the manager, still uncaring, offered to help him clock out. But Mark, filled with frustration, refused. He didn't want their help anymore. He had made up his mind. He had done enough for this company. As soon as Mark's father arrived at the store, Mark felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. His dad was no stranger to hard work and had spent his life as a jack-of-all-trades dealing with contractors and builders. He wasn't intimidated by anyone, least of all a manager who couldn't care less about his son's well-being. Mark's father stormed into the store, his boots heavy on the floor as he made his way toward the deli. Mark could already feel the shift in the air. The tension was palpable. Everyone in the store seemed to sense that something serious was happening. Mark's manager didn't know what hit him. With a calm but commanding voice, Mark's father approached the manager, his arms crossed over his chest. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "What did you do to my son?" The manager hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. "He's fine," the manager replied dismissively. "He just overreacted to some cleaning chemicals the contractor was using. It's no big deal." Mark's father's expression didn't change. He had seen this kind of behavior before, and he wasn't going to let the manager get away with it. "A cleaning chemical?" he repeated, his voice low but full of authority. "I know what's going on here. You're not fooling anyone. Where's the contractor?" The manager seemed to falter. He's outside," he said, his voice quieter now. "But this really isn't anything to be concerned about." Mark's father was having none of it. "You're damn right, it's something to be concerned about," he said firmly. "You're putting my son's health at risk, and I'm going to make sure everyone here knows what's going on. Bring the contractor to me, now." Without wasting another moment, the manager reluctantly stepped aside and called the contractor over. Mark could barely stand at this point, his body still shaking and weak, but he managed to stay upright with the support of his father. The contractor approached hesitantly, looking much less confident now that Mark's father was involved. Mark's dad immediately got to the point. "I want to know exactly what you were using in that kitchen," he demanded, his voice unwavering. "What was in that spray? You've been spraying it around people, and that's illegal. Do you have the safety sheet for it?" The contractor stammered, his face turning pale. I have it in my van. I didn't think it was that serious. I was just trying to clean." "You didn't think it was serious?" Mark's father interrupted, his voice rising in anger. "This is industrial-grade degreaser we're talking about. You're supposed to be using this stuff in empty factories, wearing a respirator, not spraying it around a kitchen full of people." The contractor tried to explain himself, but Mark's dad wasn't having it. He was already ahead of him, pulling up the chemicals safety sheet on his phone. As soon as Mark's father saw the details, his face hardened in disbelief. "This is a factory-grade degreaser," he spat. "It's meant to be used in controlled environments, not in a public kitchen, and you didn't even have the proper safety equipment? Do you have any idea what you could have done?" Mark's father wasn't finished yet. He turned to the manager and the rest of the store staff, his anger evident. "You didn't even bother to check what he was using? You let him spray something toxic around employees and customers, and now you're trying to sweep it under the rug?" The manager could only look down, his face flushed with embarrassment. Mark's father wasn't done with them. "You hired this guy and didn't check to see if he knew what he was doing? What kind of company are you running here?" The contractor tried to defend himself, but Mark's father wasn't interested in hearing excuses. The damage had already been done. The store had allowed someone who wasn't properly trained to handle toxic chemicals, and now Mark was paying the price for their negligence. "Mark, let's go," his father said, taking Mark's arm and gently guiding him out of the store. "You've done your part. I'll handle the rest." As they walked away from the kitchen and the incompetent management, Mark felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt before. The weight of the poisoning, the lack of care, and the indifference of the store's management were finally beginning to lift. It was clear now, he wasn't just going to let this slide. He was going to make sure this store faced the consequences for what they had done. As soon as Mark and his father left the store, the tension that had been building up over the past few hours began to fade. Mark still felt disoriented, his body aching from the effects of the poisoning, but his father's presence brought a sense of relief. He was no longer just an employee dealing with a toxic work environment. He was now someone who had someone in his corner. The drive home was quiet, with only the hum of the engine filling the space. Mark's father didn't say much, but Mark didn't need to hear more words. His father's actions had spoken volumes. He wasn't just protecting Mark physically, he was standing up for him in a way Mark had never experienced in the workplace before. As they arrived home, Mark's father didn't waste any time. He immediately started calling the contractor's company to file a formal complaint. Mark watched as his dad, with a calm yet firm voice, outlined exactly what had happened and demanded consequences. It was a side of his father Mark had never seen, fierce, unwavering, and determined to make sure this didn't go unnoticed. "I'm not letting this slide," his father had said over the phone. "Your contractor nearly killed my son, and now he'll face the consequences. You can't get away with this." Mark sat in silence, listening. For the first time in a while, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. His father wasn't just offering words of comfort, he was taking action. And that gave Mark the strength to believe that something could still be done. The next few days were a blur. Mark still felt the after-effects of the poisoning, headaches, dizziness, and a lingering sense of panic that wouldn't let go. But despite the physical discomfort, he knew one thing: he couldn't go back to that store. Mark had been trying to ignore the feeling in his gut that told him it was time to leave. But now, with everything that had happened, he couldn't deny it anymore. His body had literally fought back against the store's negligence, and in doing so, it had opened his eyes to just how bad things had gotten. The day after the incident, Mark called in sick. He wasn't physically ready to go back, and the thought of walking into that store made him feel like he was suffocating. But what really troubled him was the idea of going back to an environment that had failed him in every possible way. He didn't just feel betrayed by the management. He felt like his entire career had been built on a shaky foundation. He wasn't willing to risk his health or his sanity over a company that didn't care. That night, Mark sat down with his two brothers who also worked at the same store. They had heard about the incident, but Mark hadn't fully shared what had happened. Now, with his father's support, Mark was ready to tell them everything. As he recounted the details of the poisoning, the lack of care from the management, and the negligence of the contractor, his brothers listened in silence. When Mark finished, his older brother spoke first. "You're done with that place, right?" he asked, his voice firm. Mark didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I'm done." His younger brother, who had been working there for just as long, nodded. "I can't believe they treated you like that. I don't want to be a part of this anymore either." With that, Mark's two brothers made a decision that mirrored his own. They were quitting too. The three of them agreed they wouldn't let the store get away with what they'd done, and they wouldn't allow themselves to be complicit in a system that valued profit over people. They'd been working there for years, and they knew the store's shady practices all too well. They knew how it mistreated its employees, how it cut corners to save a buck, and how it cared more about sales than the safety of its staff. Mark had started this journey, but now he wasn't alone. His brothers stood with him, and together they would walk away from a place that had done nothing but exploit them for years. The next day, Mark wrote his resignation letter. He walked into the store, holding his head high, and handed it to the manager, the same manager who had dismissed his well-being just days before. The manager didn't even look up from his desk when Mark handed it to him. Mark wasn't surprised. The store had always treated its employees like disposable commodities. But now, it was Mark's turn to take control of his life. He wasn't going to let this company ruin him. He wasn't going to let them get away with what they had done to him, to his brothers, or to anyone else who had worked there. As Mark left the store for the last time, he felt a sense of empowerment he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just about quitting. It was about standing up for himself, his family, and everyone else who had been wronged by the store's practices. Mark didn't know what the future held for him, but the weight he'd been carrying for years seemed to have finally been lifted. Leaving that toxic job wasn't just about walking away from a place that had poisoned him, physically and emotionally. It was about reclaiming his life. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he had some control over his own fate. After quitting, Mark spent a few days recovering at home. His body was still adjusting from the poisoning, But the emotional relief was palpable. His headaches persisted, and the dizziness lingered. But he wasn't alone. His family supported him through every step of this process. His father, his brothers, and even his mother, who had always worried about the long hours and stress that came with the job. But it wasn't just physical recovery Mark was going through. Mark had realized how much he had internalized the stress of his old job. He'd pushed through the burnout, the toxic work environment, and the constant mistreatment, all while trying to keep his head down and get by. But in the end, it hadn't been worth it. The long shifts, the abuse from management, the lack of regard for employees' well-being, it all came crashing down when the poisoning happened. In the weeks following his resignation, Mark's father encouraged him to take some time for himself, to heal both physically and mentally. But Mark knew he couldn't just sit still for too long. He couldn't let the toxic memories of that place consume him. He needed to move forward. The first step toward rebuilding his life came when he realized he didn't have to work in a place like that anymore. There were options. There were other businesses, other industries that valued their employees, and Mark wasn't willing to settle for anything less than that. Mark started looking for new job opportunities, but he didn't jump at the first offer that came his way. He wanted a job where he could have a sense of purpose, a place that treated him with respect, where his well-being mattered. He didn't want to fall back into the same trap. And as Mark searched, he found something that felt right. An opportunity to work in a smaller, family-owned business that focused on quality over profit. It wasn't the highest-paying job, but it offered stability, a healthier work-life balance, and most importantly, a sense of value. Mark also found himself talking to other people who had worked at the same grocery store chain. To his surprise, many of them had similar experiences, both during and after their time at the company. Many of them had quit due to mistreatment, but some had stayed out of necessity or fear. Hearing their stories helped Mark understand that he wasn't alone. He wasn't just an isolated case. The store's treatment of its employees was systemic, and it was clear that something needed to change. But Mark wasn't content with simply moving on and letting the store off the hook. He knew that his departure wasn't enough. The store had done irreparable damage, not just to him, but to many other employees, some of whom had faced even worse treatment than he had. Mark realized that if he truly wanted to feel like he had made a difference, he couldn't just walk away. With his father's encouragement, Mark decided to take action. He gathered evidence, photos, documents, and witness statements from other former employees and began to speak out about the toxic practices he had experienced. He shared the details of the store's illegal use of contractors, the poor working conditions, and the various unsafe practices that had been ignored for years. Mark didn't just want revenge, he wanted to expose the truth. Mark's efforts weren't in vain. His story gained traction online, and soon, other former employees came forward with their own accounts. It became clear that this store chain was more than just an isolated case of poor management. It was a pattern of exploitation, neglect, and mistreatment that had been ongoing for years. Mark didn't know where this would lead, but he knew he had done the right thing. He had stood up for himself, for his family, and for all the other employees who had been silenced by fear or indifference. And in doing so, he had found a sense of purpose that he hadn't known before. Weeks passed, and Mark settled into his new job. It wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from what he had endured. He felt respected, valued, and most importantly, he felt safe. The work was fulfilling, and his manager was the kind of person who checked in with his staff, made sure they were taken care of, and always had an open door for any concerns. It was a complete contrast to the environment he had left behind. Mark was still healing, both physically and emotionally, but he was moving forward. The memories of the poisoning, the mistreatment, and the toxic workplace were starting to fade. And though he would never forget what had happened, he had found a new sense of peace. He had taken back control of his life, And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was finally on the path to something better. As time went on, Mark settled into his new job with a sense of peace that had been missing from his life for years. The toxic weight of his previous job had lifted, and he was no longer shackled by the fear and frustration that had haunted him during those long shifts. He no longer woke up dreading another day of work, knowing that the system would exploit him at every turn. The job he had now wasn't perfect, but it gave him something he hadn't realized he was missing: respect. At his new workplace, he was treated like an actual person. His opinions mattered. His health mattered. There were days when he could actually take breaks without feeling guilty. His managers asked how he was doing, how he was feeling, not just about work, but about life. It was a huge contrast to the apathy he had endured in his old job, where nobody seemed to care about anything other than making a profit. Mark's father had been right. Leaving the toxic environment and finding a place that valued him was the first step toward healing. It wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about creating a future where Mark could thrive. He started to feel like himself again. The pain from the poisoning was still there from time to time, lingering headaches and occasional dizziness, but they were becoming less frequent. The worst of it had passed, and as he grew stronger, so did his sense of purpose. He realized that he didn't have to accept the kind of abuse he had suffered at his old job. He didn't have to let toxic workplaces dictate his future. He could choose something better. But Mark also knew that although he was moving on, the fight wasn't truly over. He had made the decision to speak out, to stand up for himself and his brothers. His decision wasn't about personal gain. It was about holding an unjust system accountable. Mark knew that there were others who had been hurt, others who were still trapped in the same toxic environment. And while he had moved on from the store, the knowledge of what he had been through and the responsibility to speak up would always stay with him. As the months passed, Mark's brothers, too, found new opportunities. They had been by his side through the whole ordeal, and seeing Mark make a fresh start encouraged them to do the same. They left the store together, each of them finding jobs where they could feel respected and valued. For Mark, this was one of the biggest victories, watching his family break free from the shackles of a place that had made them feel small. It was a bitter part of the journey, but it was also an essential one. Mark had never felt closer to his family than he did now. He realized how much they had supported him, not just during the worst of times, but in the process of healing. The bond between them had deepened, and even though they had all gone through their own struggles, they knew that together they could handle anything. A few months later, Mark ran into someone he hadn't expected to see. A former colleague from the store who had been working there when he was still employed. This person had heard about Mark's resignation and his subsequent actions, and they were full of questions. Mark had been reluctant to talk about the specifics of what happened, but he couldn't help but share his story now. He told them everything: the poisoning, the cover-up, the management's total disregard for their employees' safety. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it felt right. Mark realized that every time he spoke out about what had happened, it was another step toward healing, not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. He was reclaiming his voice, one conversation at a time. The most powerful moment came when Mark's former colleague confided in him. "You know," they said, "I've been thinking about leaving too. I've been too afraid, but hearing your story, it made me realize I don't have to stay." Mark smiled, proud of himself and his ability to inspire someone else to make a change. That was the ripple effect he had hoped for, to inspire others to take a stand and choose something better. Months turned into a year, and Mark found a new rhythm in his life. He had a job he could be proud of, a healthy relationship with his family, and a newfound sense of purpose. The anger that had once consumed him had transformed into determination to make sure others didn't go through the same experience he had. He didn't regret leaving his old job or speaking out. It had been painful, yes, but necessary. He had taken back control of his life. As Mark sat on the porch one evening, looking out at the sunset, he felt a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in a long time. The road had been long, and the journey had been difficult, but it had led him to where he was now, stronger, wiser, and at peace. He had survived the worst, and now he was free. And in that moment, Mark knew he would never stop fighting for what was right. He would continue to speak out against injustice, continue to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and he would make sure that the store he once worked for would never get away with what they had done. And with that, Mark's journey toward healing, justice, and a new chapter in life comes to a close. But as always, every story has its twists and turns, and who knows what the next one holds. See you in the next video.